Chapter 1541. On the way back, Mama He took Su Cheng's car again. This time, Su Cheng drove very slowly. When they returned to Kaim's apartment, Mama He started to get busy. She cleaned up and washed all the blankets and sofas. Su Cheng followed behind. She didn't know how to do things, so she whispered, "You can hire someone to do this?" Mama He smiled faintly. "There are idlers in the house. Why waste money?" Su Cheng pursed her lips and didn't say anything because she was that idler. But she didn't know how to do it, so she could only follow suit. Her attitude was good, and Mama He was satisfied. After washing up for the whole morning, Su Cheng's back was sore. At noon, they even cleaned up the food they had bought. Mama Su was efficient. When dealing with its small animal carcasses, she didn't show any mercy. She was as inhumane as a doctor dissecting. Su Cheng thought secretly and sent it to Kaim. In response, Kaim only smiled. Su Cheng really thought of herself as a little girl now. She was no longer that fierce person. That was good. She was delicate, and he was willing to indulge her. Mama Su looked at Su Cheng and said, "Make a simple Sanxian noodles. We'll make do with it for lunch." Su Cheng knew that Mama Su respected men. When the man wasn't at home, the woman didn't need to eat much. She just had to make do with it. She was so tired and hungry. She wanted to eat a good meal, so she suggested, "Auntie, can I order a few dishes? Do you want to eat something good?" Mama He looked at her. Su Cheng's face was a little hot, and she felt embarrassed. After a while, she thickened her face and said, "I just don't think it's good for you to come all the way here to eat noodles." "That's good. You can make a few more dishes for me," Mama He said pleasantly. According to Su Cheng's experience, the easier it was to talk to these old women, the worse they were. Su Cheng didn't say anything. How could she know how to make it? 3 fresh noodles? But even if it was the simplest, how could she know how to make it? Therefore, during the meal, 2 plates were broken, and 2 bowls were broken. What was served on the table was a pile of black paste. Mama He looked at her deeply for a long time before she said something meaningful. "You're better off being a female artist." Su Cheng twisted her fair fingers. "Auntie, I will learn." Mama He nodded. "Okay, I'll teach you." She started making lunch, and Su Cheng just stood by her side and watched. After a while, Mother He's tone was indifferent. "All right, I also bought a live chicken that I haven't dealt with yet. It's in the trunk of your car, right? Bring it over and I'll teach you how to kill it in the afternoon." Su Cheng was dumbfounded. Kill a chicken? He might as well kill her. At the end of the day, she felt as if her bones were going to fall apart. In the afternoon, she went to take a bath. While Mama He sat and watched TV in high spirits, Su Cheng sniffed herself and felt that she was full of the smell of chicken shit. She poured half a bottle of shower gel down her throat. When Kaim returned home, he felt that Su Cheng's little face seemed to have become a small V-shaped face. He took the opportunity to pinch her. "My mom will leave after 3 days. At this moment, he was smoking on the balcony. Mama He didn't like secondhand smoke, so she definitely wouldn't come. Su Cheng happily tiptoed forward and kissed his chin. "Then after that we can do whatever we want in the kitchen." Chapter 1542. Su Cheng was a little afraid. Her back was empty. If she wasn't careful, she would fall and shatter into pieces. She could only hug him tightly and whisper, "Don't let go." He paused for a moment, then buried his face in her neck and said in a low voice, "I won't, Sheng Cheng. I won't." She trembled and looked up at him. Was this his promise? Su Cheng didn't dare to ask. At that moment, she just wanted to hug him and feel his warmth. At that moment, she felt like a woman. The 2 of them didn't dare to be too affectionate. After all, Mother He was still outside. She could still hear their movements. Kaim patted her. "Go in," he lowered his voice. "I'll hurt you later when we sleep." Sleeping time was the only time they could be alone. If his mother hadn't come over, he wouldn't have known that his desire was so strong that he didn't want to let it go for even a day. Su Cheng curled her lips, kissed his chin again and ran out. When she left, her face was a little hot. When she sat next to Mother He, she brought a cup of hot tea and put a few wolfberries in it. Mother He glanced at her but didn't say anything. She picked up the tea and took 2 sips. Su Cheng said pitifully, "Kaim said that you liked to soak a few." I saw them at the supermarket today and bought them. Mother, he glanced at her and said slowly, at least you're not too stupid. It wasn't a compliment, but Su Cheng's little face turned slightly red. Mother, he was strict, but she wanted to be close to her. She even wanted to call her mother shamelessly. She knew that she was being greedy. She liked Kaim, and she also wanted to have a normal family. She hesitated. She had originally thought of it, but she overturned it. She thought that she was still selfish. The person she loved the most was herself. When Kaim loved her, she was also absent-minded and kept letting her imagination run wild. What are you thinking about? Kaim was sweating all over. He hugged her from behind and leaned against her, kissing her white and tender neck. As he kissed, he sucked on her ear, which was the most sensitive part of Su Cheng's body. Su Cheng snorted and gasped, I'm wondering if your mother will ever like me. Kaim chuckled. Then he whipped her mercilessly. As she cried out, he flipped her over and kissed her carefully for a while before saying, It's fine as long as I like it. Su Cheng looked up. Her long black hair was drenched in sweat and wrapped around his body. Her gaze was a little empty. She wanted this moment to last forever. She felt that she was in love with him, utterly in love. For the next 2 days, although she was still tormented by Himu and learned a lot of housework, she did not do as she wished. However, at night, it was sweet and passionate. And Himu's mother would also return to her hometown on Saturday afternoon. Kaim sent her to the airport. Su Cheng was originally going to go with them, but Himu's mother had something to say to Kaim, so Su Cheng did not follow. She drove to Qin Anlin's apartment. Qin Anlin still did not go to work. He was at home doing 20 or 40 filial piety. When he opened the door and saw Su Cheng, he smiled. What's wrong? Don't you want to serve your future mother-in-law? Su Cheng glanced at him. Anlin, go, you're also making fun of me. Qin Anlin closed the door. How is this a joke? Don't you want to marry Kaim? This time, Su Cheng did not reply because she wanted to. Chapter 1543. How could Qin Anlin not know what she was thinking about? He smiled faintly. Perhaps Liang Qiu can't let it go, but she will get over it eventually. Su Cheng pursed her lips and did not say anything for a long time. She did not deserve to be forgiven, but so many people had forgiven her. She raised her head and adjusted her emotions before entering the master bedroom. Yi Liangqiu was reading a book. When Su Cheng entered, she closed the book and placed it on the bedside. You're here. Su Cheng ran over and knelt in front of her carefully. Are you feeling better now? Yi Liangqiu smiled and caressed her lower abdomen. There was already a slight bulge. She looked up. I'm fine now. It's Anlin who doesn't allow me to get out of bed. I feel that I'm going to get moldy if I lie down like this every day. Qin Anlin brought 2 glasses of milk over and handed one to Su Cheng. He then sat by the bed and served his wife. Even if it gets moldy, your husband will lick it clean for you. Su Cheng covered her face, expressing that she could not bear to listen anymore. It was too shameful. Qin Anlin glanced at her. You're making a fuss out of nothing. Didn't Kaim lick it for you? Not only Su Cheng, even Yi Liangqiu could not bear to listen anymore. She stretched out her leg and kicked him gently. Nonsense. Qin Anlin expressed that he was wronged. She did not allow him to touch her, but couldn't he just enjoy it with his mouth? However, he still gave in to the pregnant woman and spoke softly. All right, be good. Drink it. That expression of his indicated that he was going to feed her mouth if she did not drink. Su Cheng stuck out her tongue. Sister Liangqiu, you'd better drink it quickly. I'm still a child. I don't want to see such an unsightly scene. Yi Liangqiu took the glass and drank half of it slowly. Then, she said slowly, didn't you look in the mirror, child? Would the child's neck be filled with strawberries? Su Cheng let out a strange cry, her expression somewhat distorted. Qin Anlin smiled and drank the rest of the milk, leaving the space for the 2 women. After they left, Su Cheng let out a sigh of relief. Sister Liangqiu, Kaim's mother is finally gone. Then he gulped down a mouthful of saliva. When it came to killing chickens and ducks, when it came to mopping the floor, there was not even a speck of dust to be found. She must be a Virgo, Su Cheng concluded. Yi Liangqiu burst out laughing and punched the quilt. She even bought t-shirts for you? That sounds very open-minded. Ha, she couldn't help but laugh again. Su Cheng's little expression was a mess of grievance. You know, she really cares about her son, and she's super thin and super sensitive. Yi Liangqiu gave a faint smile and suddenly reached out to pat Su Cheng's head. Cheng, if you want to be happy, then be happy. How could she not know that within Su Cheng's words, there was a lot of probing going on? She wanted to be happy, but she didn't dare to. She had to get her consent first. Fu Cheng, you don't know me. You owe Xingyuan. If you want to make it up to him, think about it carefully. Yi Liangqiu's tone turned serious. Back then, Xingyuan cut the brakes, wanting to die together with you. However, you survived. She took a light breath and said with difficulty, then, you have to live well for him as well. Su Cheng was moved and her lips trembled. After a long time, she said, thank you, Sister Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes and said after a long time, the beginning of this match is not something we can choose. However, we can choose how it ends. Isn't that right, Ching? Su Cheng hugged Yi Liangqiu and she cried, she was so bad, so hateful, could she still have happiness? Chapter 1544. Yi Liangqiu hugged Su Cheng. Her heart felt heavy. Xingyuan, it might be cruel for you to make such a decision. I might feel guilty for a long time, but I don't think I will regret it. She lowered her head and looked at Su Cheng. You have to be good in the future. Su Cheng was still hugging her, unwilling to let go. Yi Liangqiu patted her. All right, Anlin will be jealous again when he sees it. Su Cheng bit her lip and let go. She glanced at her watch. It was already 4 o'clock. It was about time for Kaim to come and pick her up. Finally, his mother left. Su Cheng thought that she could have a French meal tonight. Maybe she could watch a movie or something. She suddenly felt that life was beautiful. Her eyes were sparkling. She looked at Yi Liangqiu. Sister Liangqiu, thank you. Yi Liangqiu just smiled. However, none of them had expected that just as Mrs. He was about to leave, someone would maliciously spread some indecent photos of Su Cheng on the internet. Those were probably photos of Su Cheng when she was in her rebellious phase. In a hotel room, she was wearing a nurse's uniform. Her posture was indecent. Her long hair was drenched in sweat, and her expression was blurry. It was obvious that she had done it with a man. Unbeknownst to Su Cheng, these photos had spread all over the internet when she was yearning for a better life. Qin Anlin saw it. Kaim, who was at the airport, saw it too. His expression was a little ugly. Someone had sent him a link. When he clicked on it, it was all Su Cheng's nude photos. He had long known about Su Cheng's past. It wasn't that he didn't care, but that he accepted it. But now that these photos had spread, especially at this time, it was extremely disadvantageous for Su Cheng. At this moment, he could only send his mother away. Half an hour later, Kaim watched as the plane to City D took off. He got in the car and called Qin Anlin. President Qin, help me look after Su Cheng. I'll be there in a while. Don't let her touch her phone. Qin Anlin said in a low voice, I see. After hanging up, he played with his phone for a while before making a few more calls. He wanted to use King Entertainment's power to suppress this matter, but the people were especially crazy about this kind of scandal. There was no way to suppress it. Moreover, Qin Anlin also knew in his heart that Su Shirching was behind this. After remaining silent for so long, he finally made his move. Qin Anlin got up and walked into the master bedroom. Su Cheng was still talking and laughing. When she saw him, she called Anlin Gu sweetly. Hearing this made his nose sting. He felt sad for her. He knew that Su Cheng had been trying to please Kaim's mother these days. In the past, she had been such an arrogant and willful person. She was willing to accommodate such an old-fashioned old lady for Kaim, even killing a chicken. But now, everything was ruined. He had seen Kaim's mother. There was no way she could accept these photos or Su Cheng. Qin Anlin closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was already very relaxed. Su Cheng, go and help Liangqiu get a glass of water. Su Cheng looked at him strangely, but she still went obediently. As soon as she left, Qin Anlin took her bag and put her phone away. His movements were very quick. Yi Liangqiu didn't understand. Anlin, what are you doing with Su Cheng's phone? Qin Anlin said briefly. Su Shicheng got someone to put some indecent photos of Su Cheng online. Sooner or later, Keim's mother will know about this. Before that, let's send Su Cheng abroad for a while. Chapter 1545. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. Indecent photos? Qin Anlin couldn't say much. He just reached out and patted her head. Don't worry, I'll help her. She felt uneasy, but she couldn't ask too many questions. However, they didn't know that Su Cheng was a sensitive person. How could she not be suspicious? At that moment, Su Cheng leaned against the door. She raised her head slightly and bit her lip. She knew those photos. They were taken when she was 19 years old and drunk. Su Shicheng was the one who dealt with it afterward. Great, her good father had a trick up his sleeve. Su Cheng smiled faintly. Her smile was a little sad. She knew all too well what those photos meant. It meant that she was ruined. If it wasn't for Keim, she wouldn't have cared. But now she cared. Su Cheng closed her eyes tightly, holding back the tears that were about to fall. When she returned to the bedroom, she held a glass of water with a sweet smile on her face. The water is here. Qin Anlin took it and fed it to Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu felt that this was the most difficult scene she had put on after so many years of acting. She looked at Su Cheng. Her throat felt a little sore, and she couldn't say a word. They all knew about Keim's situation. He couldn't disregard his mother's opinion. Su Cheng was still laughing without a care in the world. Only she knew that her heart was bleeding. Those who made mistakes were destined to never find happiness. Keim came quickly. He arrived in an hour. Qin Anlin made dinner and asked them to stay for dinner. After dinner, he called Keim and said that he needed to talk business. Su Cheng stuck to Yi Liangqiu. She pretended not to know. Keim sat on the sofa in the study. Qin Anlin said calmly, Keim, send her abroad. Everything will be over in 2 years. Moreover, Su Shicheng would definitely not only use these 2 moves. Presumably, Su Cheng had a lot of information that Su Shicheng could use against her. Instead of being passive, it was better to leave. With a cigarette in his hand, Keim looked at Qin Anlin quietly. After a long time, he took a deep drag and said, I'm going to send her to Canada. The weather there was cold, but it was suitable for her. Have you made up your mind? Qin Anlin put out the cigarette in his hand. If you have, I will arrange for her to be sent out immediately. Keim, if you want, you can go with her. Keim laughed bitterly. I can't leave. If he left, he wouldn't be able to explain it to his mother. Qin Anlin let out a long sigh. There's no way to suppress this matter. Keim, I'm sorry. Keim was a little moved. He knew that President Qin had tried his best. He pursed his lips and said, Thank you, President Qin, for everything you have done for me and Su Cheng. Qin Anlin sighed in his heart. There was only a limit to what he could do. He could only let Su Cheng live well in a foreign country. He couldn't help much else. The most important thing was to kill Su Shicheng. If it weren't for Liangqiu's feelings, he would have chosen to kill Su Shicheng directly. Because Liangqiu was there, he couldn't do it. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and made up his mind. Sometimes too much worry would hurt more. However, he had never thought that the storm would come so soon. Keim took Su Cheng back to his apartment. He didn't speak much along the way because he had something on his mind. He put one hand on the steering wheel and held Su Cheng's hand with the other. Su Cheng looked at him and then lowered her eyes. Keim, it's not safe to drive like this. Chapter 1546. That smile was very warm. At least, Su Cheng's heart was warmed. She pressed her face against his arm and smiled softly. There was a man who was still willing to love her after seeing her terrible past and was willing to be with her despite all the pressure. She felt that the pain of her past had been the best compensation. Her eyes were a little hot, and she said softly, Keim, have I ever said that I love you? Keim's body froze for a moment. Then he slowly stopped the car and looked down at her. His voice was gentle. It's not too late to say it now. Really? Su Cheng blinked away the tears in her eyes so that he wouldn't see it. Keim reached out and rubbed her hair. He smiled and continued driving back to the apartment. At night, no one could sleep. He lay in bed and smoked, while Su Cheng took a shower in the bathroom. She hadn't come out yet after an hour. He didn't rush her because he wasn't in the mood to do anything. He was very annoyed. How should he tell her? Or should he just knock her out and throw her on the plane? Just as he was feeling upset, Su Cheng came out. She only had a white shirt on, which was his. Only 3 buttons were fastened, and the loose collar revealed her small and beautiful collarbone. The hem couldn't hide anything, and her slender legs challenged his self-control as she walked. Kaim reached out to put out the cigarette and said hoarsely, "Come here." Su Cheng walked over slowly, climbed onto the bed, and moved to his side like a wild cat. She looked down at him, suddenly pulled out the tie on the bedside table, and held his hand. "Didn't you want to use that method?" She leaned down to his neck, bit him lightly, and then tied his hand. Kaim's gaze was deep as he stared at her in the dim light. She sat on him like a queen, pressed him down, and said with a hint of seduction, "Remember, you are a woman now." With a loud sound of pain, Kaim exploded. Su Cheng's boyfriend power was off the charts, and Kaim was as weak as a little girl. The whole process was painful, messy, and crazy. As for the details, the author didn't know either, and Kaim was quite embarrassing. However, this was just the beginning. Later, Su Cheng couldn't laugh anymore. Once a man's suppressed desire exploded, it was simply terrifying. In the second half of the night, she was pressed down again and again until she was exhausted. Both of them were exhausted, and they hugged each other and fell asleep without washing. However, Su Cheng didn't fall asleep. When Kaim's breathing became even, she opened her eyes. She looked at him silently for a long time, and a helpless smile appeared on her lips. She had thought that she had been redeemed, but it wasn't. "Kaim, I have to go. I know how important your mother is to you, and I know that you will hurt her if you want to be with me." It was the first time I didn't want to hurt someone. I didn't like her. I still felt that she was old-fashioned and even annoying. But I didn't want to make things difficult for you. I didn't want to see her cry and get angry every day. It's my fault. I didn't send a healthy Su Cheng to you. I don't deserve love in the first place. Su Cheng hugged Kaim and buried her face in his chest. Just let her feel his warmth one last time. She looked at him longingly. After a long time, she got up and put on her clothes. She took his phone and drove away in her car. The night grew darker and darker. She cried as she drove. Chapter 1547. Su Cheng drove the car into a hotel. There was a room that she had booked for a long period of time. She took the room card and entered. There was a computer and cell phone inside. She walked in and immediately closed the door. She picked up her cell phone and dialed a number. After hanging up the phone, there was a sound of someone kicking the door, but she had locked it from the inside. She turned on the computer and her slender fingers tapped lightly on the keyboard. After a while, a video was released. The male and female leads were her and Su Cheng. She laughed softly. Did he want to destroy her? In that case, she would be more thorough. They would hurt each other. She had already given up everything. There was nothing she could not give up. Reputation and innocence. What right did Su Cheng have to have those things that she did not have? Su Cheng laughed. She laughed with tears in her eyes. The door was finally kicked open. 4 men in black came in. Of course, Su Cheng was among them. When he saw the computer light up, his expression changed. "You spread the news?" His voice was cold and he couldn't believe it. Wasn't she with that Kaim recently? How could she dare to send out such a video? Yes. Su Cheng stood up slowly and looked at Su Cheng. Suddenly, a maniacal smile appeared on her face. "Dad, we are even now. We are going to be rats crossing the street. Are you happy?" She laughed, but her face was full of tears. Su Cheng narrowed his eyes and gave her a tight slap. "You're crazy." This lunatic, the lunatic that he had raised with his own hands, had destroyed him. He had underestimated her. She was even more ruthless than he had imagined. Su Cheng's face was slapped to the side and she could not come back for a long time. There were 5 bright red handprints on her face. She could even see traces of blood. It was clear how much strength Su Cheng had used. "Yes, I'm crazy." She turned around and was still smiling. She laughed heartlessly. What about you? Aren't you crazy? She raised her hand almost crazily. Who forced my hands to be stained with blood? Who didn't give me a chance to live? Her voice was hysterical and close to screaming. You clearly know that I love him, but you still did it. I want to destroy you. Yes, I want to drag you down with me. Su Shirching, you should have died long ago. Su Shirching's face became colder. It seems that your existence in this world is unnecessary. He raised his hand and was about to instruct his men to kill Su Cheng, but a row of police officers with guns stood at the door. Su Shirching froze. Su Cheng, on the other hand, giggled. She moved closer to his face and said in a very soft voice, like a complete lunatic, "Dear Daddy, you didn't expect this, did you? Even if I die, I'll drag someone down with me." She chuckled. "I'll slowly confess all the shady deals you've done behind my back. I'll become a tainted witness." Su Shirching sneered. "Then what about Lin Xingyuan? Do you think you can get away with killing him? The number of people you've killed is enough for you to die." His eyes were filled with hatred. He was determined to kill Su Cheng, no matter what method he had to use. However, Su Cheng was fearless. "Even if I die, you can't escape." However, Su Cheng didn't know that sometimes, fate wouldn't treat her badly. She looked death calmly in the eye, but in the end, fate played a kind joke on her again. Su Cheng and Su Shirching were taken away together. Su Cheng was facing a criminal charge, while Su Shirching was facing a financial case. He was soon bailed out by his lawyer. Some authors said that demons have bad morals and that bad people don't get punished. Now that Su Cheng is going to jail, do you feel like crying? Chapter 1548. When Su Cheng saw Kaim, it was 4 o'clock at night. In the dim light of the small room, Su Cheng had already lost her youthfulness. She looked a little yellow and her hair had lost its luster. She and Kaim sat facing each other. Kaim's pupils contracted as he looked at her, and his lips were pursed tightly. He clenched his fists on the table and tried his best not to lose his temper at her. Su Cheng kept her head down. He didn't speak for a long time. She looked up at him and said softly, "Actually, you don't have to come." He must have seen that video, and after that, he probably didn't want her anymore. She was such a bad girl. It would be good for him if she could distinguish between them in the future. Kaim looked at her and repeated her words coldly. "I don't have to come? Are you saying that I don't need to care about you anymore and that we should break up?" His voice was stern and Su Cheng froze. She couldn't move or speak for a long time. Kaim looked at her with pain in his eyes. It was a pain that she couldn't understand. If she could understand, she wouldn't have done this. "Because I can't protect you? Because I can't give you confidence? Do you think you can make me give up with just a few photos?" There was a hint of desolation in his sternness. She knew that if she admitted to everything now, she could be sentenced to death for her crimes. And he couldn't do anything about it. No matter what she was like, no matter how much his mother disliked her and disagreed with their marriage, as long as she was alive, there would be hope. However, Su Cheng ended everything. He looked at her with hatred in his eyes. She had given him such a dazzling joy, as beautiful as fireworks in the night, but in the end, she had ended everything with her own hands. "Su Cheng, I've never hated someone so much." He looked at her. "If you come out alive, I promise I'll kill you." He said it fiercely, but his eyes were red. He couldn't save Su Cheng because that idiot had told him everything she had done. He knew that she wanted to drag Su Shirching down with her and ruin his reputation. Su Shirching was so smart. At most, his reputation would be tarnished. Su Cheng was suddenly at a loss. She looked at Kaim and twisted her fingers together. Her voice was very soft. "Kaim, I'm sorry. If there's a next life..." He interrupted her before she could finish her sentence. Kaim's voice was bleak. "What do I want to do in my next life? I don't have it in this one." Su Cheng looked at him, bit her lips, and her fingers almost dug into her flesh. It was time, but Kaim didn't leave. He looked at her. Only a few hours ago, they had been madly in love with each other's bodies, but now that she was in such a place, how could he walk away? He had exhausted all his connections just to see her. Su Qing cried and covered her face with her hands. Kaim, what can I do? I can't escape. Not only can I escape Su Shiqing, but I also can't escape my own conscience. Kaim smiled faintly. He looked at her for a while, but his heart softened. He held her hand and leaned forward. Don't cry. Su Qing shook her head desperately. I'm not afraid. I'm really not afraid. Kaim, it's just that I'm really going to lose you. She let go of his hand. Her eyes were red and swollen with tears, and her body was trembling slightly. Kaim's heart fell to the bottom. Chapter 1549. After a long while, he said, You'd better live well. If you're alive, your surname will be He. Su Qing was stunned. Kaim looked at her deeply again before turning to leave. Su Qing sat there for a long time. She looked up and the dim light stung her eyes. She covered her eyes and cried. She didn't regret it. She really didn't regret it. Kaim left and smoked a cigarette outside. He looked up and saw Qin Anlin's car. He was surprised and his eyes felt a little hot. After standing for a while, Qin Anlin came out. He was dressed in black, and he was submerged in the night. How did you know something happened? Kaim's voice was a little hoarse. Qin Anlin handed him a cigarette and smoked one himself. He blew out a smoke ring and said, I couldn't sleep at night, so I looked through the news. It was all over the place. He paused for a moment. Liang Qiu also knows about it. The Lin family said that they wanted to sue Su Qing to death. For Liang Qiu, this matter was also a great blow. Lin Xingyuan's family had always trusted her, but after Su Qing turned herself in, Liang Qiu's phone rang countless times, and every time, it was to scold her. In the end, he turned off her phone. Kaim looked up and sighed. She's so stupid. If he had known that his love would drag her down, he would have never started it. He hadn't been able to protect her. He felt guilty, but he couldn't tell her about it. If he did, she would feel even worse. Qin Anlin understood Kaim's feelings and patted him on the shoulder. I'll try my best. However, Qin Anlin knew that if it was just the case of Su Qing killing Lin Xingyuan, he would be able to get her out. However, this matter involved ATV and even her and Su Shiqing's scandal, so everything would be even more difficult. He wasn't confident, and he didn't even know if he could save her life. Kaim also knew that, which was why he was in so much pain. He nodded. President Qin, you can go back first. Qin Anlin let out a long sigh. Be careful on your way back. Kaim didn't leave. She just sat in the car for the whole night. It could be considered as accompanying her. He didn't know how long he would be able to accompany her. If he could accompany her for a day, then that was one day. If he could accompany her for a night, then that was one night. Early in the morning, when Kaim returned to the apartment, she was surprised to see her mother. Mrs. He sat on the sofa, her face stiff, without a trace of a smile. Kaim stood at the entrance, looking at his mother. After a long while, Mama, he said, Shuheng, break up with her. Kaim was still standing at the door, looking at her mother. After that, he slowly placed the key on the shoe cabinet, walked over slowly, and sat beside Mother He. He wiped his face with his palm and said softly, Mom, I can't let it go. If I could let it go, I wouldn't have started. Mama He was stunned. She looked at the son she was so proud of and tried to decipher the meaning of his words. Her blood was boiling, and her body couldn't help but tremble. She pointed at Kaim and said sternly, You saw what kind of person she is. Can the He family accept such a slutty woman? She's a murderer. Kaim closed his eyes. Mom, if I give up on her now, she'll have nothing. Mama He's voice became even more stern. She doesn't deserve it. Shuheng, wake up. She'll destroy you. Although the He family wasn't rich and powerful, they had always been innocent. A girl like Su Qing, she would feel guilty if she got involved in the slightest. Chapter 1550. If it weren't for him, she wouldn't have done this. She was helping him, and how could he let her be alone? Mama He was stunned. She murmured, Shuheng, you've gone mad. Are you going to let me down, your dead father down, and yourself down? Kaim closed his eyes. Mom, I'm giving up on her. I'm not letting anyone down, but I'm letting down my own conscience. He looked at Mama He. She may have committed a heinous crime, but I like her and she loves me. Our love is not sinful. His determination shocked Mama He. She couldn't accept her son like this. She was in a daze. After a long time, she suddenly collapsed. Mom? Kaim called out to her and held her, but Mama He fainted. Kaim sent her to the hospital. She had suffered a stroke, but fortunately, she was saved in time. Mama He didn't talk to Kaim when she woke up. She just lay there and refused to eat. He knew that she was silently protesting with her life. Kaim stayed in the ward, worried. Day after day passed. Although Mama He was still alive, she was getting more and more haggard. She lay there quietly and didn't look at Kaim or talk to anyone. Kaim held a bowl of porridge and half squatted in front of her. He said in a low voice, "Mom, eat something." After this incident, Mama He's health wasn't as good as before. She didn't eat, so her body collapsed. She relied on an drip to maintain her health. The doctor said that she had to eat, otherwise it would be detrimental to her condition. She might even collapse. Kaim's voice made Mama He open her eyes slightly, but she only took a glance at him before closing them again. She didn't want to look at him anymore. Her voice was soft and indifferent. "I won't eat until you break off with her. Forget it. If you die, I won't have to see you like this." Mama He said, tears streaming down her face. She shouldn't have let her son come to this world. If he had stayed in D-City, he wouldn't have met such a girl. She had let down her husband and the He family. She hadn't taken good care of her son. Mama He threatened to kill herself. Kaim couldn't watch her commit suicide like this. He begged and even knelt down, but Mrs. He did not budge. 2 weeks later, Mother He's breath was weak, and the expression on her face was like she was dying. Kaim knelt down and cried. He held a bowl of porridge in his hands and said in a hoarse voice, "Mom, I won't go and see her. I don't want her anymore, okay?" Mother He opened her eyes slightly and looked at him. Her expression seemed to be a little incredulous. Kaim closed her eyes. "Mom, I'm serious." However, his tears never stopped. He was forced to give up on Su Cheng. If he didn't, his mother would die, and he couldn't bear the burden of another family member's life. Mama He watched him cry and reached out to wipe away his tears. "Shuheng, you'll forget her? You'll forget her." But she didn't think that her son would never see Su Cheng even once in her lifetime. But 10 years later, she would die and Su Cheng would come back. Kaim promised Mama He and really didn't go to see Su Cheng anymore. He entrusted everything about Su Cheng to Qin Anlin. He believed that President Qin would do his best. Chapter 1551. Su Cheng, on the other hand, was sentenced to death and would be executed in 2 months. The day he received the news, Kaim sat alone in the apartment for a very, very long time. From day to night, he was alone, crying quietly. Mama Su sat in her wheelchair, watching her son. She still hadn't relented. She didn't allow him to see Su Cheng one last time. He didn't mention it either. He just became even more taciturn. He pushed her out to the park every day, chatted with her and took care of her. When he was at work, there would be an auntie to take care of her. Her health was getting better day by day, but she and her son were becoming more and more distant. He wouldn't tell her anything if he had something to do. Most of the time, he would lock himself in the study for 5 to 6 hours. He lived his life as usual, but he had lost a lot of weight. He was so thin that he was almost out of shape. Mama He wanted to speak up every time, but in the end, she didn't. She told herself that she had made the right choice. If she relented, Shu Heng's life would be over. In the CEO's office of King Entertainment, Qin Anlin looked at Kaim. His voice was a little serious. "Aren't you going to see her?" There wasn't much time left. It was only about half a month. Kaim's eyes were a little warm. His thin fingers flicked the ash off his cigarette. He looked at Qin Anlin and smiled. But there was no smile in his eyes, and there was no soul in them. Qin Anlin felt his heart ache. He couldn't blame him. Kaim had no choice in this battle. Kaim looked up and said softly, "Tell her that I'll be waiting for her in the next life." He had once told Su Cheng that he didn't want a next life, but now he could only wait for her. In this life, they weren't fated. He thought that he wouldn't get married again. He would wait for his next life with a clean heart. At that time, he could still tell her that she owed him Su Cheng. He had waited for her for so long. He thought that if he had someone else, she probably wouldn't care about him. So he wanted to be clean. Qin Anlin's throat seemed to be stuck. After a while, he said, "I will." He paused. "Kaim, if you have a next life, do you still want her?" Kaim's gloomy eyes brightened for a moment, but they soon dimmed again. After a long time, he said softly, "I can wait, but can she wait? Su Cheng is pregnant, your child." Qin Anlin's voice was very calm, but it was like a super bomb had been dropped in Kaim's heart. He looked at Qin Anlin with burning eyes, and his hand holding the cigarette kept trembling. He tried his best to steady it but failed. He could only look at Qin Anlin like that. After a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, "Really?" Qin Anlin nodded. "It's only been a month." Kaim changed her death sentence. If she performs well in the future, it might become 20 years, 10 years. Kaim took a long drag from his cigarette, but his fingers were still trembling uncontrollably. He looked at Qin Anlin with cloudy eyes and clenched his fist. "I'll wait for her. Su Cheng, I will wait for you." He cried again. This time, it was tears of joy. They were going to have a child. How much did she love him? That was why she was willing to give birth to their child when her life was about to end. She loved him. Kaim raised his head and smiled. His Ching wasn't perfect, but at critical times, she was more loyal than any other woman. So what if they weren't together? They would be reunited eventually, and their child too. That day, he went back and pushed Mama He to the park. Mama He could already walk, but he was still pushing her most of the time. Chapter 1552. Mama He's eyes widened. She wanted to make a sound, but she couldn't say a single word. Kaim looked at her seriously and said softly, "Mom, I want this child." Mama He didn't say anything and just stared at him. "Mom, that's my child." Kaim squatted down and looked at her gently. "If it were me, would you not want me?" Mama He's lips moved as she stared at her son. Kaim didn't say anything else. He stood up and pushed her slowly in the small park. There were many elderly people in the park with their children, enjoying the joy of a family. Mama He suddenly put her hand on the back of Kaim's hand and said hoarsely, "You can bring the child back." Kaim's eyes were a little moist. He knew that this was already difficult for his conservative mother. "Thank you, Mom." He continued to push her, murmuring as if to himself, "I won't see her." The more he acted like this, the sadder Mama He became. She asked softly, "Shuheng, will you hate me?" Kaim smiled. "I won't." He really wouldn't. Whether it was him or Su Cheng, they had chosen an unconventional path, and his mother had borne what she shouldn't have. He felt guilty, so how could he hate her? Under the setting sun, Kaim stood in the afterglow and watched the sunlight shine on the water. He squatted down and spoke softly to Mama He. He had 10 years to accompany her. 10 years later, she might not be around. At that time, he could accompany Su Cheng. He didn't go to see Su Cheng, partly because of his mother, and partly because he knew that Su Cheng didn't want him to see her in a sorry state. She had always loved to be beautiful, so she must be in a mess now. Kaim smiled slightly. Yi Liangqiu went to see Su Cheng. Su Cheng was living in a small cubicle alone because she was pregnant. Although the conditions weren't good, it was much better than living in the big room. This place was a little far from B City. Qin Anlin drove for 6 hours to get there. Su Cheng was in a good state of mind. When she saw Yi Liangqiu, she pursed her lips and kept standing. She was wearing a prisoner's uniform, ordinary and empty. She didn't look like the little princess Su Cheng from before at all. She looked at Yi Liangqiu in silence, smiled, sat down, and raised her hand. Yi Liangqiu also raised her hand and pressed it against hers through the glass. Cinderella has returned to her original appearance. Su Cheng had a bitter smile on her face. Yi Liangqiu felt bad for her. Cheng, why are you so stupid? This is the best home for me. Isn't it? Su Cheng smiled bitterly. Sister Liangqiu, I've never regretted it. It's just that I never thought I would have this child. She reached out to touch her lower abdomen, a pained expression on her face. She didn't blame Kaim for his choice. She had heard from Anlin Gu that his mother had threatened to kill herself and he had no choice. Actually, she didn't blame him. She did this because she would rather he cut off all ties with her. But the child, Kaim told you to wait for him. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very soft. Su Cheng, I will hand the child over to Kaim. He will take good care of it. Su Chen's eyes widened, unable to believe what she had just said. He wants this child? She pursed her lips and asked cautiously, does his mother want it too? Yi Liangqiu's palm was pressed against hers. That is his child. Cheng Cheng, you have to come out alive. Because Kaim is waiting for you. Chapter 1553. Su Cheng cried. Although Sister Liangqiu didn't say anything to her, she knew. She understood Kaim's heart. She cried and said, Sister Liangqiu, do you know, I still haven't regretted it. It was only now that she understood that she wouldn't be dirty when she came here. Instead, she would be cleansed of the sins on her body, so that she could be with Kaim with a clear conscience. If she went out that day, she would be able to face Mama He calmly and dare to tell her that she wanted to be with Kaim. Su Cheng smiled. She was crying and laughing at the same time. Yi Liangqiu handed her the things she had brought. She had prepared some of them, but most of them were prepared by Kaim for her. There were nutrition products, underwear, and some daily necessities, afraid that she wouldn't be used to it. Su Cheng held the things and buried her face in them. She didn't speak for a long time. Yi Liangqiu watched quietly for a long time. When she went out, her heart was heavy. Qin Anlin leaned against the front of the car and waited for her. She turned back to look at the four corners of the sky, feeling a little melancholy. She didn't know how many years it would be before Su Cheng was here. And how long would Kaim have to wait? Qin Anlin went forward and put his arm around her shoulder. He said in a low voice, she will be fine because someone is waiting for her. Sitting in the car, she looked at everything in the car. Her comfort was the first priority. She couldn't help but think of Su Cheng again. Su Cheng was used to being pampered. Would she be able to take it? Anlin, I want to come and see Su Cheng often, she said softly. Qin Anlin nodded. If it's inconvenient for you in the future, I'll do it. He patted her hand. I'll get someone to take care of her. The child will be born safely. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything else. She knew that Anlin did all this for Kaim, and more so to take care of her emotions. When the car drove back to B City, it was already evening. The sky was originally fine, but it was overcast, and it looked like it was going to rain. When she got out of the car, she looked at the sky. Qin Anlin urged, let's go in. It's getting cold. It won't be good if you catch a cold. Yi Liangqiu tilted her head and looked at him. Anlin, I'm born in autumn. I'm not afraid of the cold. You only know how to say silly things. Qin Anlin smiled and brought her into his arms as they went upstairs. But when he returned, he received a call from the housekeeper of the Su mansion, saying that Su Shiqing was sick with lung cancer. Yi Liangqiu held the phone in her hand and was stunned for a moment. She said calmly, I called the wrong number. She hung up the phone and remained silent. Qin Anlin heard the voice over there. He pursed his lips and said, if you want to go take a look, then go take a look. ATV's current situation is very bad. The stock market has plunged, and Su Shiqing is surrounded by various scandals. This illness must be caused by anxiety. Yi Liangqiu looked down. There's no need to see it. Let that kind of person live and die on his own. Qin Anlin did not say anything. He just hugged her and let her face rest on his shoulder. Liangqiu, his Liangqiu is so silly. If you don't want to see it, then don't. His voice was very calm. I will always be with you. At the Su mansion, the housekeeper put down the phone and looked at Su Shiqing. Su Shiqing's eyes were more or less longing. He was half lying on the bed. The flesh on his face was almost dry, and he had lost his former high spirits. She refused, didn't she? His voice was old and hoarse. The housekeeper was in a difficult position, but he still nodded. Missy said, she called the wrong number. How could she not know? She just hates me. Su Shicheng sighed and slowly lay down. She hates me to the core. Chapter 1554. But the more this child resembled him, the more their relationship as father and daughter could not turn back. Su Shicheng smiled softly, and his smile was bitter. It was not a pity, but a pity. The career he created would finally become a bubble. ATV's stock market plummeted, and he was powerless to save it. Not to mention, with his current body, his current reputation, it would be difficult to recover. The only thing he had left was his Liangqiu. He believed that she would be able to fulfill his wish for him. Su Shicheng smiled softly. He waved the housekeeper away and he took out a photo from the drawer. The photo was a little old. There were 2 men and a woman, all very young. After so long, it's time for you to see the light of day again. Are you happy? Su Shicheng smiled softly, and his smile was full of satisfaction. I didn't expect that leaving you alive at that time would have such a use. He struggled to get out of bed. Even such a simple action took a lot of effort, and he coughed violently a few times. After doing this, he would find a sanatorium and recuperate. He wanted to live a few more years and watch ATV recover its former glory. He hated that bitch Su Cheng, but he never dealt with her because he didn't want to break Liangqiu's bottom line. That child liked Su Cheng. If he pushed her too far, even a rabbit would bite. Su Shicheng held the wall and pushed open a door, from which there was a long staircase leading down. As soon as he walked down, there was a cold air coming from inside. Ordinary people couldn't stand it, let alone a sickly person like Su Shicheng. He raised his hand, and a string of dim yellow lights lit up inside. Climbing down the stairs, the lights dimmed again, and there was actually a cold wooden prison inside. Su Shicheng stood still and looked at the person sitting in the wooden prison. You're finally here. The man's voice was faint, and then he looked up. The light shone on his pale face, without a trace of blood. His hair was also very long, draped over his shoulders, like an ancient person. The clothes on his body were so dirty that it was impossible to tell when he changed them. It was impossible to imagine how long he had lived under such conditions. Su Shicheng looked at the person in front of him and smiled. We haven't seen each other for more than 10 years. The man chuckled. It's been more than 10 years, but I've heard what you've done in the past 10 years. Su Shicheng's cell was really exquisitely made. The people outside couldn't hear her cries for help, but they could clearly hear what Su Shicheng was doing in the room, including what Su Shicheng did with his wife. Since that's the case, you should know what I want to do. Su Shicheng chuckled. By the way, don't you care about the woman you eloped with? That person was silent for a long time before saying, I don't care anymore. The mistake had already been made, and it was difficult to reverse it. Why did he still have to ask about that lowly woman? Su Shicheng chuckled. She's dead? He paused for a moment before continuing. Those who know too many things don't live long. Especially this kind of woman. I took care of her for you. Are you happy? That person stared at Su Shicheng for a long time before saying in a deep voice, You have no humanity. What is humanity? Su Shicheng's eyes were full of indifference. Humanity is just something that makes people weak. Chapter 1555. The man looked at him for a long time before he said coldly, Su Shicheng, what tricks do you want to play? If you don't take good care of yourself before you die, you will only die faster if you plot against others. Su Shicheng looked at him and said softly, I just want you to reunite with your family. After saying that, he turned around and walked upstairs. The man who was sitting suddenly wanted to stand up when he saw his back. However, he didn't have legs, so he couldn't stand up. He could only crawl on the ground with his hands. His voice was even more mournful. Su Shicheng, what do you want to do to her? Tell me clearly. His voice echoed in the cold and gloomy wooden prison. His voice kept reverberating, like a ghost. The door closed slowly, and Su Shicheng's voice came slowly. We can't tell each other clearly. He was not reconciled. He was not reconciled to the destruction of everything he had painstakingly built. Everyone was happy, and he was like an old man waiting for death. How could he be reconciled to this? Because of Su Cheng's matter, Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlin's wedding was postponed to October. Yi Liangqiu was already 3 months pregnant, and her belly was slightly bulging. When she tried on the dress, Qin Anlin personally served her, and the dress had been changed again and again. "My waist is so thick." She looked up at him. Qin Anlin smiled and reached out to touch her belly. "That's our baby daughter growing up slowly." When she was pregnant with Mu Yun, he didn't participate. Because there were too many things before, he didn't have the mood to feel joy. At this time, he really felt like a father for the first time. However, this joy couldn't be known to little Mu Yun. Anlin. She put on the wedding dress. Because the hem was loose, he couldn't see that she was pregnant. Instead, she looked a little more plump. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "The people around me left too quickly." She gently turned around and rested her face on his shoulder. Her arms gently wrapped around his waist. "We'll be fine, right?" Qin Anlin grunted in acknowledgement and patted her. "Why are you so melancholic?" Yi Liangqiu smiled but didn't say anything. In fact, she knew that a few days ago, Su Shiqing went to the hospital and got into a car accident on the way. It was caused by Anlin. He didn't say, and she didn't ask. Because of that blood relationship, she couldn't deal with Su Shiqing like he did. But she didn't stop him. Her heart was heavy. She thought that no matter how much she hated that person, if he died, she might be sad. But if that person lived, everyone could die. Because Su Shiqing was crazy. Qin Anlin looked at her expression and probably knew what she was thinking. He reached out and stroked her hair. These were the darkest and darkest things in their hearts, the only things that could not be shared. And after that, they would use a long time to heal each other's scars. This was something that both he and Liangqiu had to bear. She lifted her face and buried herself in his arms. The wedding was a week later. On that day, Xiaoxin and little Mu Yun were the flower girls. Originally, the bridesmaids and groomsmen were Su Cheng and Kaim, but now that Su Cheng was gone, the groomsmen and bridesmaids were changed to artists from King Entertainment. All the female artists from King Entertainment wanted to be President Qin's bridesmaids. Although President Qin was married, it wasn't a big deal to have a confidant in the entertainment industry. Chapter 1556. When Yi Liangqiu saw the group of bridesmaids, she still felt uncomfortable. Because Xia Mian was also there. She was wearing a light blue gown, revealing her cleavage and long, slender legs. Her long hair was tied up high, revealing her fair neck. She had the ambition to steal the bride's limelight. Yi Liangqiu remembered that Xia Mian wasn't an actress from King Entertainment. Why was she here? She paused and finally stopped beside Xia Mian. This was not auspicious, but Yi Liangqiu knew that she had to do this. Xia Mian had dared to come to her wedding. If she didn't do something, she would disappoint Xia Mian. Qin Anlin's eyes fell on Yi Liangqiu. He was waiting for her at the altar, but she was still dawdling. Yi Liangqiu's voice was soft and gentle. "Miss Xia, help me drag the hem of my dress." Xia Mian's eyes widened. She knew that Yi Liangqiu would notice her and might even suspect her relationship with President Qin. However, she didn't expect that Yi Liangqiu would be so calm. She even asked her to drag the hem of her dress. She instinctively refused. "I'm a bridesmaid." "Isn't that the job of a bridesmaid?" Yi Liangqiu smiled. "Miss Xia, you think the daily salary is too low. I'll ask Anlin to give you an extra 1,000. This was a complete humiliation. Although it was a little harsh, Yi Liangqiu felt that she didn't need to show mercy to a girl like her. Xia Mian didn't seem to know what it meant to give up. She was chasing a man all the way to the wedding. How could she not care about him? Qin Anlin didn't notice it at first, but then he noticed that Xia Mian was indeed there. He didn't look too good either. He felt that he had never given Xia Mian any hints, nor had he given her any hope. Xia Mian didn't move, but Yi Liangqiu was waiting. Qin Anlin didn't take pity on her or say anything to help her out. The atmosphere was tense, and Xia Mian had brought this upon herself. A wisp of warmth appeared in her eyes. She bit her small and delicate lips, looking extremely pitiful and humiliated. She finally squatted down. But when her fingers touched the hem of Yi Liangqiu's dress, Yi Liangqiu's voice was indifferent. Have you thought it through? Your dream was to chase after a man who didn't belong to you? Xia Mian had said that she would become the best actress, but now she was like a mouse looking for a chance to take advantage of a loophole. Yi Liangqiu felt sorry for her. She was even more foolish than she was in the past. Dressed like this, she bent down so that all the men could get a glimpse of her. But Xia Mian didn't care. She wanted to stay. This is the path you chose. Yi Liangqiu walked forward slowly. Her voice was very soft. No one decided for you. She had never hated anyone, not even Mo Xiaoqi back then. Tomorrow, she would demand that all of Xia Mian's paths be sealed. She wanted this girl to be unable to survive in B City. Yes, she was jealous. She hated that Xia Mian looked at Anlin with that weak look. That disgusted her. Xia Mian really disgusted her. However, Yi Liangqiu wasn't one to be trifled with. She asked Xia Mian to squat down and tidy up the hem of her dress. Then, she exchanged rings with Qin Anlin and kissed him. Xia Mian's eyes stung. She admitted that she was a bitch. She shouldn't have come. Chapter 1557. Qin Anlin didn't even look at her. Not only that, but he didn't wait for the banquet. Instead, he called the PR manager in charge of the wedding and asked her to remove Xia Mian from the team. What was going on? She was trying to make him unhappy on the day of his wedding. Liangqiu was angry. How could they consummate their marriage tonight? Of course, he couldn't touch Yi Liangqiu right now. But even if he couldn't touch her, it would be nice to nibble on her. It was better than having nothing at all. Everyone was relieved after Xia Mian was replaced, especially his wife, who looked like she was getting married. Qin Anlin breathed a sigh of relief and brought Yi Liangqiu to 2 tables of wine. Most of them were elders and relatives. He was worried that she was too tired and worried about her mood. After all, she didn't have any relatives present. Fortunately, it was Tang Yu who handed her to Qin Anlin at the wedding. And it was Qin Anlin who owed her. Even though it was such a grand occasion, it couldn't hide the fact that she had lost her family. Qin Anlin took her to the lounge upstairs. He was a little drunk, but he still helped her to the luxurious bed covered with red sheets. Yi Liangqiu was a little tired, but it was better than him being drunk. He was the one who took her up, but in the end, it was Qin Anlin who fell on the bed. Yi Liangqiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She reached out and pulled him. They're waiting for you downstairs, President Qin. She didn't pull him up. Instead, he pulled her down. In the end, she lay in his arms and he put his palm on her belly so that he wouldn't hurt the baby. Yi Liangqiu covered her heart. Looking at his charming face, she hit him and said, "Bastard." He pretended to be drunk. Qin Anlin smiled lightly. If I didn't pretend to be drunk, why would they let me come up? At this moment, she was wearing a red wedding dress. The wedding dress was like fire. Her facial features were delicate and pretty, just like a woman getting married in ancient times. Qin Anlin put his hand on the back of her head and slowly took off a dragon and phoenix hairpin. Her long black hair suddenly fell down, like a curtain, messing up his eyes. He clasped her shoulders, looked up slowly, and kissed her lips. Her long hair scattered around, as if forming a small world. In that world, there was only him and her. The kiss was light and gentle, as if he was afraid of hurting her or scaring her. Liangqiu. He called her name as he stared at her. She wouldn't know that his heart felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. That kind of satisfaction was something he had never felt before. She was finally his wife, Qin Anlin's exclusive woman. He cupped her face and kissed her face, her eyebrows, her red lips. Liangqiu, you look so beautiful today. His voice was extremely hoarse. Many women could be considered beautiful, but not everyone could use the word beautiful. Tonight she was so beautiful that it was intoxicating. She was like water, like a ball of fire, burning him completely. However, he was drunk after all. After kissing for a while, he let go of her with a low smile and fell to the side. I might not be able to do it tonight. His breath was warm as it sprayed onto her soft neck. Then, he reached out and pulled her into his embrace. Turning over, he whispered into her ear and told her how happy he was to be able to marry her. Chapter 1558. Yi Liangqiu just wanted to get up, but he pulled her back and held her carefully. "I'm not drunk. Let me hold you for a while." He held her as he wished and buried his face in her. "Liangqiu, let me hold you for a while." She felt a little helpless. He said that he was not drunk, but he was obviously drunk. However, his breath was warm and so was his body. She was more or less moved. So, she lay down with him in the wedding dress and enjoyed the peace of life. On such a joyous day, it was wonderful to have such time to lie down quietly. Her long hair was like a waterfall. The person who said he wanted to hold her for a while was not very obedient. Tonight was his wedding night. He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. It was warm, but he was not satisfied. He sat up and held her in his arms. She was unprecedentedly gentle. She leaned in his arms and did not let him kiss her for a while. She lowered her head and put her finger on his chest. Why is she in the bridesmaid group? Qin Anlin let out a long sigh. He knew she would ask that. He lay down and let her lie on his shoulder. He looked at her and reached out his hand to touch her delicate face. He sighed. It turned out that the newly married Liangqiu could be so beautiful. "If I say I don't know, will you believe me?" He pinched her little face and smiled faintly. He pulled her to his level and looked into her eyes with a smile. "Liangqiu, you look like you're jealous?" Yi Liangqiu kissed his lips. "Yes, I am jealous." She looked so cute at this moment. She pouted her lips and looked up at him. She was married to him in a wedding dress. Qin Anlin's heart was filled with lofty sentiments. Right now, he was dressed in fine clothes and riding on a horse. He wanted to do something, but he was worried about the child in her belly. In the end, he didn't do anything. He only lightly touched her belly. He paused for a while and then said calmly, "Liangqiu, no matter how long it takes, I won't have another woman, let alone Ximian." He reached out to touch her head again and smiled. "But I'm still very happy that you mind." After saying that, he kissed her on the lips. Thinking of the guests downstairs, he kissed her again. "I have to go down now. Wait for me to come back to the bridal chamber." She looked at him and snorted, "You're not serious at all." Qin Anlin smiled and touched her face. Then, he adjusted his clothes and prepared to go down. "Wait a minute," she called to him. Qin Anlin stood by the bed while she knelt by it. "Can't bear to part with me?" He lowered his head and couldn't stop himself from kissing her again. He couldn't bear to leave, but if he didn't go down now, he was afraid that they would come up and make trouble. She was pregnant, so it wasn't suitable for them to be in public. After kissing and rubbing, he finally let go of her. "You have lipstick on the corner of your mouth." She blushed and helped him wipe it off. Qin Anlin didn't mind. "It's quite sweet." Cupping her face, he said, "Baby, wait for me." After kissing a few times, she finally stopped. She knelt there, reached out her hand to touch her lips, and smiled softly. Anlin looked very happy. She could really make him happy. She could make him happy. She smiled blissfully. Then, she got off the bed gently and took a shower. She changed into a white silk pajamas, the kind that looked very sexy. She sprayed some natural perfume, which smelled like roses. Lying on the red sheets, she felt tempted. Chapter 1559. 2 hours later, Qin Anlin returned to the suite. He was helped into the room. The one who brought him in was Kaim. After helping him into the living room, Qin Anlin sat down on the sofa. After calming himself down, he began to make a ruckus. "Liangqiu, darling, your husband is back." Another person smiled at Kaim. "Let's go first. Leave this to President Qin." There was a hint of warmth in his smile. How could he not understand? Kaim lowered his eyes. He was reminded of Su Cheng. Su Cheng was also pregnant. However, they could not be together for the time being. He could not even see her once. He was afraid that if he did, he would not be able to hold on. He would break his mother's heart. Kaim retreated and declined the invitation to join the gathering. Then he walked alone in the cold and empty courtyard of the hotel. The moonlight shone down on the ground, creating a faint glow. The strong night wind blew his hair and the cigarette he was smoking. He sat on the bench, his expression even colder than the night. He knew very well what kind of place prison was. He did not go to see her. However, he secretly stood under the sky and looked at the place she was staying. She was so small, so restricted. With her lively personality, how could she get used to it? Cheng, you said you did not regret your choice. Then I won't either. If you want to atone for the mistakes you made, then I will be with you. You are inside and I am outside. However, if you know my heart, you will know that I am waiting for you. He picked up a bottle of beer and gulped it down. It did not take long for over 10 bottles to be scattered on the floor. That night, Kaim drank himself into oblivion. It was only in this state that he dared to call out her name. Only in this state did he dare to let it out. Only in this state did he dare to cry out. Some people were happy while others were sad. Compared to Kaim's coldness, GM Hotel's presidential suite was filled with sweetness. Qin Anlin sobered up slightly. Relying on his instincts, he staggered back to the room. The moment he entered the room, he was stunned for a moment. Then he slowly sat on the edge of the bed, reached out to remove his tie and threw it to the side. He then loosened his collar and looked at her with a burning gaze. Uncontrollably, he leaned over and kissed her. As he kissed and rubbed her to wake her up, he murmured, "If I had known that you would wait for me like this, I would have come earlier." However, no matter how tempting she was, he only dared to kiss her and did not dare to do anything else. In the end, he really had no choice but to carry her and walk to the bathroom. "Hubby will take you to take a bath together." Yi Liangqiu woke up. Being hugged by him like that, she was a little scared. She reached out and hugged his neck tightly. "Anlin, put me down." He did not let go and kissed her again. "I'm not letting go." The voice whispered in her ear, "I won't let you fall." She glanced at him. "You're so drunk." Qin Anlin smiled and carried her into the bathroom. He pressed down on her and kissed her again. After kissing her, he pulled at her in a messy manner and said dirty things from his mouth. "Call me hubby. Hubby will help bathe the baby." It was useless for her to struggle. He was not as gentle as usual when he was drunk. He was a little forceful and was more like a child playing house. She could only let him be. Soaking in the water together, she sighed softly. "Anlin, I've never thought that we could really get married." Everything was so beautiful that it made her want to cry. But behind this beauty, there was too much pain. She lay on his chest and even wondered if all of this would not have happened if she had not returned back then. Was his world, Su Cheng's world, Kaim's world, and everyone else's world peaceful and beautiful? Chapter 1560. Qin Anlin was drunk all the time. He held her face and kissed her affectionately. His voice was a little muffled. "Silly Liangqiu, in this world there were no ifs. If there were any ifs, it was everyone's own choice." He kissed her and pressed her jade-like face against his chest. Suddenly, he was filled with lofty sentiments. He felt that it was enough to just hug her on such a quiet night. Nothing else mattered. He reached out and stroked her back. Then he lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "This is what it feels like to be a husband. Liangqiu, what about you?" Her face was pressed against his chest. It was indescribably soft. She rubbed it again and grunted in agreement. Qin Anlin's blood instantly heated up. He wanted to kiss her. He held her face and kissed her for a while. He was afraid that he couldn't control himself, so he put her down. After soaking for a while, he was probably sober. He looked down at her and realized that she was almost asleep. Qin Anlin smiled and wiped his face with a towel. He picked her up and kissed her lightly. "Baby, don't fall asleep. We still have to consummate our marriage." When he said that, she giggled. She was so happy that she couldn't stop giggling. As she lay down, she put her arms around his neck. "Anlin, what are you going to do?" After a while, she seemed to be in love with him. She lifted her body and moved closer to his ear. She even took a small bite of him and asked mischievously, "Hubby, what are you going to do tonight?" He was happy that she could do this. His fingers caressed her delicate face. Marriage only happened once in a lifetime. If she was in a bad mood, then it would be his fault. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed the corner of her mouth. He chuckled softly. "Baby, what do you think I should do?" His fingers moved down her arm and clasped her hand. Their fingers intertwined. He stared at her delicate face. He felt that he would never get tired of looking at it for the rest of his life. He reached out and gently rubbed her face. His voice was alluring. "Baby?" "No." She turned her face to the side. There was a faint blush on her cheeks. He reached out and gently touched her. She shyly stepped aside. Qin Anlin smiled, his voice a little hoarse. "You're still shy after so many times?" She nodded and buried herself in his arms. Her voice was especially soft. "Don't move." Her fair skin, contrasted with the red, looked especially sparkling and translucent. He almost couldn't bear to let go of her. He just lay there with her, saying intimate words and teasing her. Half the night actually passed. In the end, it didn't work out because she was pregnant. He was unwilling to let her go just like that and waste his wedding night, but he was also indescribably satisfied. When they woke up in the morning, their gazes met, each with a different kind of charm and gentleness. "Good morning, hubby." She took the initiative to hug his waist and kissed him on the corner of his mouth. Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse. "That's it?" His voice was unbelievably hoarse. She pressed her lips against his and whispered, "What do you want then?" Her whole body fell limp in his arms. He wouldn't be a man if he could resist it. So he leaned against her ear and whispered a few words. She looked at him in surprise and then turned her face away. He thought that she would refuse, but he didn't expect that she would turn her little face away and say in a low voice, "Really?" Chapter 1561. He nodded. Then she moved closer to his lips and kissed him, slowly moving downwards. The ecstasy was like a tsunami. He was like a pitiful young man who couldn't control himself. In the end, he still pulled her into his arms. He couldn't bear to do that to her. He kissed her lips pitifully. "Liangqiu, I won't do this to you." She giggled in his arms, her slender fingers poking at his heart. Her voice was filled with joy. "But I want to do this to you." Qin Anlin let out a long breath. This was killing him. He reached out and caressed her red lips. "Mrs. Qin, you've learned bad things?" She chuckled softly and lay in his arms. She was especially happy. "I learned it all from you." He patted her little butt. "All right, time to get up." She was pregnant, so their honeymoon was only a week long, and it was in the country. However, for newlyweds, a week without children was also very precious. Especially Qin Anlin. He couldn't wait to shove his son back into his wife's belly so that they could have a world of their own. He took her to the south, or rather, to the place she had been to for the past few years. Yi Liangqiu took him on the path she had taken before, brought him to eat her favorite food, and kissed him in the hotel suite at night. Even though they were an old married couple, there was still a different kind of romance when they were newlyweds. There was a lot of rain in the south during autumn. When it rained, they would quietly listen to music in the room and enjoy the rain outside. He would cook for her, take good care of her, and feed her well. Qin Anlin looked at the rain outside the window and looked down at his new wife in his arms. He smiled. "Liangqiu, I used to think that living a life of luxury was the only way for me in this life." He didn't expect that such a peaceful life could make him feel so satisfied. Even he couldn't do anything with her other than kissing and nibbling. Yi Liangqiu retreated a little and sat at his feet. She also looked at the drizzle outside and tilted her head to look at him. She smiled faintly. "Anlin, that's because you didn't touch me." He smiled and went over to rub her head. Then, he dragged her over again. He pressed one hand on her shoulder and the other on her lower abdomen, feeling their little one. The little fellow was more than 3 months old. At this time, when he placed it on her lower abdomen, it actually moved a little. Qin Anlin was shocked. He raised his hand and his gaze fell on her face. "Liangqiu? The move. It's not like it's a little beast." But in Qin Anlin's heart, it was just a small animal, a wonderful little creature. Would it swim in Liangqiu's stomach? What would it look like? His expression was very silly, just like all the fathers in the world. Yi Liangqiu laughed. Anlin, this is fetal movement. It's clearly the one moving. As Qin Anlin said this, he straightened her up and let her lean against the backrest. Then he lay on her belly. He felt that it wasn't good, so he lifted her clothes. This way, he wouldn't be able to feel the presence of the little fellow on her belly. Then he felt the little thing wriggle. Qin Anlin was extremely surprised. He looked up at Yi Liangqiu. How can there be someone as silly as you? You already have a son. She placed her hand on his head and slowly scratched his scalp. Her expression was gentle. Chapter 1562. Qin Anlin couldn't help but laugh. This is the first time I've felt it. He loved Mu Yun, but he seemed to like the little one in her belly even more. He had a feeling that it would be a little girl. He had been envious of Tang Yu's little heart for a long time. It must be fun to pinch such a chubby little thing. As he thought about it, he couldn't stop touching her belly and felt that he was more and more awesome. Tang Yu couldn't make Pei Chi-Chi's belly bigger again. Qin Anlin felt that he was about to ascend to the heavens. He chuckled and pinched his little wife's face. Isn't my husband awesome? Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Shameless. Qin Anlin was full of pride again. He trapped her in his arms and chuckled. Tell me, isn't your husband awesome? Yi Liangqiu was speechless. She pinched his cheeks and said, Hubby, you're so awesome. Why didn't any of the women get pregnant? Qin Anlin was a little confused. It didn't seem appropriate to say that. He reached out and pinched her cheeks again. Did I? Where else could there be other women besides you? You still won't admit it? She bit the tip of his nose, her eyes sparkling. He was a little dazed. After a long time, he leaned over and kissed her eyelids. He said gently, Liangqiu, you don't know how much I love you. Yi Liangqiu glared at him. That's not what we're talking about. But that's all I want to talk to you about. Qin Anlin looked at her. You don't know how cute you are. She was actually not a cute girl. She was very tall and had a strong aura, but she would be cute in private. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. They're not as cute as your harem. He smiled. He especially liked when she was jealous. He rubbed her hair as if he was petting a little animal. They're not compatible with me. I can't get pregnant. As soon as he said that, she kicked him. Yi Liangqiu kicked him harshly. You still dare to say that? He chuckled. I like it when you're jealous. She kept quiet. Qin Anlin looked at her. Are you angry? She turned her face away and looked out of the window. You're angry. He laughed. How do you want me to coax you? Although he said that, he still looked at her affectionately. She was wearing a loose white dress, and her long hair was let down. She was unspeakably ethereal. Her beauty needed to be savored slowly. Yi Liangqiu turned her head and looked at him. Do 100 push-ups. Qin Anlin smiled, jumped down from the window, and laid on the ground. He looked at her. Liangqiu, come up here. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and still sat on his back. Qin Anlin started doing push-ups. Only then did Yi Liangqiu know what an electric motor was. But he was so bad. He purposely made that embarrassing sound, as if he was doing that kind of thing. She covered her ears. He finished doing 100 push-ups in a short while. After that, he carefully took her off and turned over to look at her. Liangqiu, are you happy? Yi Liangqiu squatted down. I'm happy to see you tired. He kissed her. After giving birth, I made you tired every day. Shameless. She bit his lip. Pervert. Chapter 1563. She didn't need to wait until after giving birth to the child. She would feel tired from being pestered by him every day. After returning to B City, Qin Anlin brought her and little Mu Yun to live in the villa. Naturally, he also arranged security guards around to ensure her safety. Her prenatal checkup, if it didn't require the use of large equipment, was almost always done at home. Qin Anlin would send a car to invite Dr. Mei over and send her back after the checkup. This time was no exception. When he came back, Yi Liangqiu looked at him and hugged her knees. "You've never sent me off like this before." Qin Anlin sat down and looked at her. He smiled. "Then I'll take my little friend out to ZZ?" His little friend was arrogant. "I don't want to go out." She had been lazy since she came back from the south and didn't like to go out. However, he wanted to take her out to relax. At least, it would be easier for her to give birth after exercising more. However, she was really blessed by nature. Even though she ate so much and didn't exercise, she still had slender hands and feet. She was a natural clothes rack. If she wore loose clothes, no one would be able to tell that she was pregnant. Qin Anlin couldn't do anything about her clinging to him like this, but he still took her out no matter how hard he tried. It was an early autumn evening. The sunset was beautiful, and the scenery of the park was pleasant. Qin Anlin pulled his little girl with a doting look on his face. At first, Yi Liangqiu didn't want to go out, but now she was in high spirits. She sat by the lake with Qin Anlin and fed the fish. She wore a pair of white pants with Qin Anlin's light blue shirt. She was tall, so she looked surprisingly good in it. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail, which made her look especially elegant. Qin Anlin reached out and pulled her into his arms. He hugged her and accompanied her. Looking at her happy expression, he felt happy in his heart. After getting married, she would more or less think of Su Cheng and the lonely Kime. She couldn't let go of it. So, he wanted her to be happy. He gave her a marriage, not because he wanted her to be happy, but because he wanted his Liangqiu to feel happy because of him. Qin Anlin smiled and held her in his arms. His heart was indescribably soft. He hugged her and pressed his lips against the side of her neck. "Look, there's a big fish there." He looks quite stupid." "Anlin, he looks a bit like you." She chuckled. He glanced at her and reached out to smack her head. "Nonsense." However, he soon laughed. "If I were that fish, I would be quite stupid. Otherwise, why would I be fooled by you?" Yi Liangqiu stared at him. He chuckled and coaxed her. "All right, I'm a stupid fish." It was rare for her to be happy, and he didn't want to spoil her mood. Only then did she happily continue to throw bread to the little fishes. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of her, blocking her line of sight. She looked up at the person in front of her. Unexpectedly, it was Su Shiqing with a nanny supporting him. The current Su Shiqing was completely different from the Su Shiqing 2 months ago. His face was yellow and his figure was much thinner. He looked at the two people hugging each other, and a faint smile appeared on his face. His voice was also faint and gentle. "Liangqiu." Yi Liangqiu stared at the man in front of her. She knew that he was sick. It seemed that he was really sick. She felt a little sad, but she wasn't sad. Chapter 1564. I waited for you here on purpose. Although Su Shiqing's face was scrawny, his expression was unprecedentedly kind. He slowly said, "You and Anlin didn't invite me to your marriage." His eyes fell on her belly, and after a while, he said softly, "The child is almost 4 months old." He smiled bitterly and coughed violently a few times. "I haven't prepared anything for her yet, so I can make up for it with your wedding." Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little stiff. "I don't need it." Su Shiqing's face was a little pale, and he looked a little embarrassed. His facial muscles trembled a few times, and then he said in a low voice, "It's a token of my appreciation." With that, he gestured to the nanny next to him, and the simple middle-aged woman handed a file bag to Yi Liangqiu from her bag. Yi Liangqiu was not willing to take it. "Take it. Consider it my atonement." Su Shiqing's voice was indifferent, as if he had seen through everything. "I have brought your mother back, and I will take good care of her in the future." He paused before saying, "In the future, when I am not here, you will take care of her." In Qin Anlin's arms, Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and couldn't say a word. Qin Anlin gently let go of her, squatted down and picked up the file. "President Su, take it back. Liangqiu's ambition is not here." He didn't have to think about it to guess what was in the file. It was a hot potato. As expected, it was the shares of ATV. What tricks was Su Shiqing thinking? Su Shiqing looked at Qin Anlin and smiled slightly. "Anlin, she is my daughter." How do you know that her ambition is not here? Anlin is right. Yi Liangqiu's voice was cold. I have no interest in ATV at all. Su Shicheng looked at her face and didn't get angry. He just said lightly, Liangqiu, it's time to go home. His words would cause misunderstandings, especially from Qin Anlin. Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlin. Seeing that his expression was normal, she felt relieved. She picked up the document and handed it to Su Shicheng. Give up, I won't go back. She would never go back to that dark place again. Su Shicheng smiled faintly. You don't want your mother anymore? Yi Liangqiu looked at the person in front of her. He was so impeccable. Family, marriage, nothing could be his weakness. If he could do it, so could she. If her heart softened because of Mrs. Su, then she would have fallen into his trap. As for Mrs. Su, she would solve it through the Su family. Su Shicheng could not afford to offend the Su family now. So she said resolutely, I never had the chance to choose. Su Shicheng was startled for a moment. Then he laughed lightly and coughed. Liangqiu, you are just like your father, decisive and ruthless. After that, he looked at her deeply, took the bag and left slowly. He walked slowly and coughed from time to time, like an old man who was dying. Yi Liangqiu stood there and watched for a long time. Let's go back. Qin Anlin hugged her and then said with a relaxed expression, the air here is not good. I won't come again. Yi Liangqiu grunted. She really didn't want to see Su Shicheng. After seeing him once, she didn't feel very well after going back. She even had a low fever at night. Qin Anlin was busy all night, and she finally settled down. Chapter 1565. There was a fine sweat on her body, and he gently wiped it off for her. Finally, he put her in his arms. Liangqiu, I will find a way to get your mother out. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. He rubbed her hair. How could he not know what she was thinking? She always looked cold, but her heart was warm. Mrs. Su did not treat her well, but she could not be heartless. Yi Liangqiu looked at him, and her long hair stuck to her face. After a while, she said softly, I dreamed of her. Qin Anlin reached out and gently held her in his arms. He stroked her long hair. I will bring her out for her. She leaned on his shoulder, and her fingers quietly wrapped around his waist. She bit his shoulder. Anlin, I feel like a dream. From the Yi family to the Su family, it was so heartbreaking. Qin Anlin understood her vulnerability. He reached out and stroked her little face. His voice was quiet. Liangqiu, you have me in the future. They don't want me, and no one cares about me. Anlin, I am unnecessary. She still cried. She used to yearn for family. She yearned for Wang Kaiyun to love her. She yearned for her biological mother, Mrs. Su. She even yearned for Su Shicheng's appreciation. But the fantasy was so easily shattered. For them, she was either a burden and dispensable, or she was a pawn. She admitted that she was a bit unreasonable. But she still could not help but feel sad. Qin Anlin held her face and kissed away the tears in the corner of her eyes. His action was very gentle, with infinite pity. Liangqiu, it's not like that. Coaxed her. Because they don't know how to cherish it. They have too many selfish desires. They don't know how to love. Just like him, he also understood how good she was after so many twists and turns. Only then did he know that he could never leave her. She cried like a child in his arms. He coaxed her for a long time. Liangqiu, I have already kissed you. Don't cry. For the first time, she was so relieved to give herself to someone else. She was so relieved to give all her vulnerability to him. Thanks to Qin Anlin's efforts, Mrs. Su was finally taken back to the Su family. She finally had a good home. This was also because Su Shicheng was under pressure from the public and he had his own plans. And Mrs. Su was not his target. Moreover, using Mrs. Su to threaten Yi Liangqiu was useless. When the Su family picked up Mrs. Su, especially Mrs. Su's mother, she slapped Su Shicheng and forced him to write a divorce agreement. Yi Liangqiu knew that if the Su family came forward, it was probably Qin Anlin's negotiation. He must have given something in exchange. That day, She was sitting in the car with Qin Anlin beside her. She watched as Mrs. Su walked out of the Su mansion. Mrs. Su's figure was thin, and she looked absent-minded. When the driver opened the door for Mrs. Su, she suddenly looked in Yi Liangqiu's direction. Yi Liangqiu sat in the car. Her body was a little stiff and she did not move an inch. Qin Anlin sighed softly. He put his hand on the back of her hand and said in a low voice, "Liangqiu, you can see her whenever you want to. There may not be such a chance in the future." Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Her eyes were a little hot. "Anlin." She called him and suddenly said, "I feel that you are very forgiving now." He smiled. "You know that too." With that said, he got out of the car and opened the door for her to get out. Chapter 1566. Yi Liangqiu didn't move until Mrs. Su came over. Mrs. Su's surname was Chen. Old Madam Chen also came over. Although she was in her 80s, her eyes were still bright. She looked Yi Liangqiu up and down before asking, "Are you that child?" Old Madam Chen was in politics. Her voice was naturally dignified. No one in the Chen family was not afraid of her. This time, they were able to successfully take Mrs. Su away because of Old Madam Chen. Old Madam Chen had a lot of dissatisfaction with this daughter. She had originally given up on her, but Qin Anlin came to the Chen family. Yi Liangqiu was being looked at. She retracted her gaze and looked at the old woman in front of her. She smiled faintly and said, "Yes?" Old Madam Chen's expression was still old-fashioned and strict. "In terms of seniority, you should call me grandmother." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly again. "In terms of seniority, I should still call you Mayor Chen." But no one had ever dared to disobey the old woman like this. She was furious and glared at Yi Liangqiu. "You are so rebellious. No wonder your mother doesn't like you. Instead, she likes that weird Su Cheng." As she said that, her pair of shrewd eyes kept looking at Yi Liangqiu, as if trying to see through her inner thoughts. Yi Liangqiu remained unmoved. Kinship is nothing to begin with. Just like Mayor Chen. We're clearly related by blood, but what's the difference between that and not? Old Madam Chen was furious. "You don't know what's good for you." She turned back to look in the direction of the Su family and sneered. "Do you think he will let you go? You are the only heir of the Su family. That madman Su Shiqing will not give up so easily. You know he is a madman. Why did you agree to their marriage?" Yi Liangqiu looked at the ash-covered Old Madam Chen. Old Madam Chen's expression dimmed. "Is there any use in stopping him?" She looked at Mrs. Su. Mrs. Su was still in a daze. She held onto Yi Liangqiu's hand and cautiously called out, "Cheng Cheng?" Qin Anlin held Yi Liangqiu's hand to give her some warmth. He knew that she would be sad. However, she wasn't angry. Instead, she thought of Su Cheng. Yi Liangqiu was not a pretentious person. She could be unhappy, and she could get Anlin's comfort, but Su Cheng didn't give her anything. What she gave her was only the four corners of the sky. At this moment, she understood Mrs. Su's love for Su Cheng a little more. Su Cheng was a little crazy, but it could not be denied that she was also cute. He pursed his lips and allowed himself to be hugged by Mrs. Su without resisting. Her voice was a little low. Even if it was right before and now it was wrong, when she buried her head in Mrs. Su's shoulder, she really felt the warmth of an hour. Mom called her Su Su, called her little darling. It was a warmth that she hadn't felt for a long time. However, the price was too high. She closed her eyes. Her eyes felt a little hot, so hot that tears almost fell. Mrs. Su coaxed her and called her Cheng Cheng. She told her not to be afraid and that her mom was here. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. There was an indescribable feeling in her heart. She called out to her mom in a soft voice. Perhaps this was the last time. This was his only chance. Anlin is very good. Cheng Cheng, listen to him in the future, Mrs. Su said incoherently. Old Madam Chen's voice was dignified. All right, let's go. Chapter 1567. Mom has to go. Cheng Cheng, you can visit Mom later. Mrs. Su's tears flowed down. She still looked confused and couldn't tell who the person in front of her was. Yi Liangqiu watched her being taken away. From the beginning to the end, Mrs. Chen's face was stiff. She didn't give her daughter any warmth. Anlin, she is the same as me. She doesn't feel warmth. That's why she loves Su Shiqing so passionately, right? She put her head on his shoulder and asked softly. Qin Anlin watched the black limousine slowly drive away with her. Then he said, the Chen family has been in politics for generations. They are indifferent to human relationships. There are a lot of things that they can't control. He looked down at her. And your mother, she is a different kind of person in the Chen family. When she fell in love with Su Shiqing and insisted on marrying him, she was not optimistic about her. What he didn't say was that the Chen family was not optimistic about Mrs. Su. Consequently, they were not optimistic about Yi Liangqiu. Mrs. Su might not be able to get what she wanted when she went back, but at least her life would be safe. Maybe in the future, when Liangqiu gave birth to a child, he could pick Mrs. Su up and let her live in a place not far from them. If Liangqiu wanted to see her, she could see her. Su Shiqing didn't have many years to live. What Qin Anlin wanted to do now was to wait for him to die. From an emotional point of view, he didn't want to hurt Liangqiu. He always wanted to give the best to her. Anlin, thank you. She pursed her lips and looked up at him. Qin Anlin smiled and held her hand. Liangqiu, let's go home. She nodded and was helped into the car by him. On the second floor of the Su family's house, Su Shiqing stood there, watching Qin Anlin's car slowly drive away. The man standing behind him whispered, "Why didn't you do something in the car?" Su Shiqing slowly turned his head and glanced at him. "Do you think I will let my own daughter die with me?" That person didn't say anything because in his heart, there was nothing that Mr. Su couldn't give up. Su Shiqing looked into the distance again, and said with melancholy, "If I am gone in the future, who will witness the glory of ATV?" He was running out of time. Originally, he had frozen his sperm, but he didn't have many years left. Even if he found a woman to give birth to a child, if he couldn't control it for himself, what was the point? The person behind him said in a deep voice, "Mr. Su, I was wrong." Su Shiqing looked into the distance quietly. After a long time, he said, "Is everything ready?" The man nodded. "I'm ready." Su Shiqing chuckled, "Then send it out tomorrow." As he spoke, he coughed a few more times. The man exclaimed, "Let's call a doctor." "No need." Su Shiqing's voice was very calm. "Monin, there's no cure for my illness." He was only taking medicine to maintain his life. His illness came so fiercely. What could he do even if he was unwilling? Monin was a confidant cultivated by him. Hearing Su Shiqing say this, he didn't say anything. The next day, when Yi Liangqiu was alone at home in the afternoon, the maid at home delivered a package. "Young madam, this is your package." It was sent by express. She took it and was a little surprised, but she still opened it. Inside was a CD. Yi Liangqiu was a little curious, so she opened it. 10 seconds later, her face was completely pale. At the same time, her cell phone rang. The sound was like a ghost, touching her heart, as if it was pinched by something, and she couldn't breathe. Chapter 1568. Liangqiu, did you see that? If you want to save them, don't hang up. Otherwise, I'll destroy her immediately. The voice on the other end was like a ghost. You can't bear to do that, can you? Think about Qin Anlin, he loves you so much. Yi Liangqiu looked at the computer. After a long time, she gently removed the disk from the computer and folded it in half. Then, holding the phone, she hesitated for a few seconds before going out. She was more than 4 months pregnant, but she still drove by herself. When the servant asked, she just said that she was going to Qin Anlin's company to deliver some documents. Sitting in the car, she turned on the phone and saw a scene that broke her heart. She had no choice but to drive to the place that Su Shiqing had specified. When she arrived at an abandoned factory, her car door was opened and 2 men in black came in. They quickly blindfolded her. Then she got into another car. The car drove and stopped. After making countless turns, it stopped about an hour later. The cloth under Yi Liangqiu's face was removed. When she opened her eyes, she was surrounded by dark and rusty buildings. She held the phone and looked around. There was a big pool in the middle of the warehouse. Dirty water floated in it, and there were white things floating in it, which made people want to do evil things. Just then, a voice rang out. Liangqiu, you've come after all. Yi Liangqiu looked up and saw Su Shiqing. He was sick to begin with, and appearing in such a place made his body even more fragile. Are you crazy? Yi Liangqiu's body was trembling, and her voice was a little shrill. Where is she? Where is she? Ignoring herself, she walked up the iron-stained staircase and quickly went up. Su Shiqing was wearing a white shirt. 2 buttons were loose at the collar, and there was a scratch on his neck. It was a woman's fingernails. Yi Liangqiu's eyes were hot. Where is she? Tell me. Su Shiqing looked at her hysterical look and smiled faintly. You care about her a lot? As he got closer, she could smell the faint scent of a man and a woman who had done it. It was faint, but she could smell it. Yi Liangqiu's body swayed slightly. She almost couldn't accept such a blow. Are you crazy? Her face was covered in tears. How could you do something like that? That's Anlin's mother. Su Shiqing sneered. She volunteered. I didn't force her. He gently raised his hand, and a strange sound suddenly came from the pool below. A wooden prison slowly rose from the inside. The water curtain fell, revealing the people inside. It was a man without legs. His original appearance had long been unrecognizable. His hair was so long that it draped over his shoulders, and it was tangled. Su Shiqing held the railing with both hands and smiled faintly. Do you know who he is? Yi Liangqiu's face was stiff, and so was her body. She kept looking at the person in the wooden cell. A premonition rose in her heart. You've guessed it? Su Shiqing's fingers gently touched his lips. He's Qin Pei, Qin Anlin's father, a man who abandoned his wife and child. His expression suddenly became a little absent-minded. But Honka was still willing to give herself to me for his life. He turned his head and looked at Yi Liangqiu. Do you know that she has never had another man for so many years? Chapter 1569. The man in the wooden cell heard the noise and slowly raised his eyes to look at Su Shiqing and Yi Liangqiu. There was a trace of sadness in his eyes. Just an hour ago, he had personally witnessed his wife being pressed under Su Shiqing's body and doing that as if she had gone crazy. He and Hongke had been married for so many years, but he did not love her that much. Otherwise, he would not have left so easily. However, after not seeing each other for so many years, she had aged. On the day they reunited, she cried her heart out. She did not scold him for being unfaithful, but her heart ached for what he had gone through. Hongke was pulled away. Su Shiqing, that bastard, actually let her choose. If she did not want him to die, she would do that with Su Shiqing. Hongke was over 50 years old. She had lived her whole life high and virtuous. She was such a proud woman. When he left, she did not cry or ask him to stay. But now, she already had silver hair, but she had given herself to Su Shiqing for him. When her silver hair fell, he seemed to see their wedding day. At that time, she was so beautiful. On their wedding night, she had also let her hair down and lay in his arms. The overlapping memories turned out to be the most tragic pain in the world. This kind of pain exceeded all the pain he had suffered all these years. He called her name again and again. Hongke, why did you do this? Why did you care about me? Why did you care about my life and death? A person like me does not deserve to die. She was not a little girl after all. She was in pain. She was in pain. She let out painful sounds. Every sound was a death to him. At that moment, he wished he could die. He hit his head with all his might, desperately trying to kill himself. In the abandoned warehouse, his mournful cries could be heard. Hongke lay on the ground, and a tear fell from the corner of her eye. However, he did not know that she had liked him since she was young. She had liked him for a very long time, she had done so much for him, but he did not know and left just like that. She wanted to hate him, and she had hated him for so many years, but in the end, her heart still ached for him. She had said that she was older than him by 3 years. No matter what mistake he had made, she would forgive him once. Qinpei, you're back? You've become like this. Her heart ached. That teardrop almost corroded Qinpei's heart. After so many years, he felt guilty towards her, but he didn't really regret it. It was because he felt that he didn't love her, and it would be better if he left. But now, he wanted to love her. He wanted to start over. He remembered that morning when he woke up, she wanted him to hold her and tell him that she was pregnant. How nice it would be if he didn't leave. They would have a daughter, and they would be happy. He was the one who destroyed everything. Qinpei's eyes were fixed on Su Shiqing, while Yi Liangqiu's face was pale. Suddenly, Qinpei let out a strange sound, calling Hong Ke's name. Yi Liangqiu froze for a moment and ran in the opposite direction. She ran as fast as she could, not caring that she was pregnant. She was afraid that if she was any slower, she would be too slow. But when she ran into a small abandoned house, she was still too slow. Lady Qin leaned against the wall, only covered with a coat. Her hair was loose, and a few strands of silver could be vaguely seen. Her face seemed to have aged a lot in an instant, but it also seemed like she was a little girl. She held a metal rod in her hand tightly, and a stream of blood slowly flowed down from her forehead. Chapter 1570. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she tried to lift Mrs. Qin up, but she couldn't. "Mom." She patted Lady Qin's face and said anxiously, "Mom, don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep." Lady Qin lay in her arms. She opened her eyes slightly and closed them weakly. After such a long time, Lady Qin said with difficulty, "Liangqiu, let's go, let's go, let's go." The blood on her forehead flowed down her cheeks, and the dark red stained Yi Liangqiu's sight. Lady Qin's face twitched slightly, and a tear fell from the corner of her eye. "I can't let him go." "I know." Her eyes fell on Yi Liangqiu's face, and there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. She knew that she and Anlin would be implicated, but she still had a glimmer of hope that Su Shiqing would let Qinpei go. But when she heard that Liangqiu was coming, she knew that she should die. She didn't want to keep the last trace of life. She was the shame of Anlin. She couldn't live anymore. Her fingers suddenly grasped Yi Liangqiu's hand, and she used the last of her strength. "Liangqiu, don't tell Anlin." She raised him, so how could she not know his character? Even if he killed Su Shiqing, even if he chopped Su Shiqing into meat paste, Anlin would suffer for the rest of his life, and he would feel guilty. But it wasn't Anlin's fault. It was her. She couldn't let go of that person. Su Shiqing stood at the door and looked at the wound on Lady Qin's forehead in shock. Yi Liangqiu hated him, but she didn't want Lady Qin to die. She couldn't die. If she died, what would happen to Anlin? "Send her to the hospital." She looked at Su Shiqing and her voice was sad. Su Shiqing quickly walked over and half knelt beside Lady Qin. His fingers trembled as he stroked her wound. His voice trembled even more. "Hongke, why did you do this? Do you really hate me that much?" He really couldn't accept it. How was he inferior to Qinpei? When Qinpei left, if not for Hong Ke, how would King Entertainment be where it is today? His fingers sank deep into her flesh, his heart aching. Lady Qin opened her eyes slightly and looked at Su Shiqing. This man loved her. He had loved her his entire life. She knew it, but she couldn't fit anyone else in her heart. "Let him go." Lady Qin clasped Su Shiqing's arm with her fingers and said in a hurry, "Let him go." She had already lived for so many years, while Qinpei had lived a life worse than death for so many years. She wanted him to go back and take a look. The house in which they had lived was just as he had left it, the same silver candlestick that had been lit on the night of their wedding, on her dressing table. She had waited for so long and hoped for so long. She had lit it every day to take a look before going to bed, hoping that he would come back. Now, she knew that he was still alive, but his life made her heart ache. Hopefully, there would be a next life as husband and wife. "Qinpei, are you willing to make up for my lifetime of waiting?" However, she couldn't ask him any. Her old eyes were dyed red, and that trace of red climbed up the last trace of her face. I'm a little tired from waiting. I want to rest. I'll go back to our home and wait for you. She let out her last breath and said, "Let him go." However, she couldn't say the last word. Mom. Yi Liangqiu knelt and looked at Lady Qin. Chapter 1571. Her fingers trembled as she caressed Qin Fu's face. She called her name again and again. However, the eccentric lady who first met her would never wake up again. She seemed to have lived a wealthy life, but she was actually lonelier than anyone else. She dedicated her life to the Qin family. She gave her last breath to Qin Pei. Yi Liangqiu hugged Lady Qin. Her tears fell like rain. She let out a sorrowful cry. She pressed her face against Lady Qin and didn't let go. Warm tears brushed past Lady Qin's face, but they could no longer warm her. "Mom, are you still in pain?" she murmured. It must be very painful to bear the humiliation that she didn't want to bear. "Mom, it won't hurt very soon. I'll send you off on your last journey on behalf of Anlin, okay? I can't let others check your body and let your last words be trampled on. Don't worry. I'll let him live. I'll protect Anlin. I will. I will avenge you. Mom, it will hurt later. Anlin won't be able to see you for the last time. He will hate me. If he hates me, then so be it." Yi Liangqiu smiled gently. "Mom, we are actually the same kind of people. Once we love someone, we won't give them up. We'll love them to the end even if we have to risk our lives. We'll use our last breath. If only one person can be happy, Mom, I hope that person is Anlin." "Yes, it's Anlin." Yi Liangqiu stood up slowly. Her expression was a little dazed, and her eyes were a little dazed. Su Shiqing was the same. He was still immersed in his own grief. "Honka, how could you be so stupid? It's not worth it for that man." However, no matter how much it's not worth it, it can't be exchanged for her life. At this moment, Su Shiqing couldn't say that he didn't regret it. "Do you have gasoline?" Yi Liangqiu turned to look at Su Shiqing. Her voice was very soft. Su Shiqing's old eyes looked a little listless. After hearing her words, he turned to look at his daughter in shock. Obviously, she was calmer than him. "Do you want Qin Anlin to know what you did to his mother?" Yi Liangqiu's voice was cold as if it was frozen. Su Shiqing's heart twitched. After all, he was smarter than most people. He immediately understood what she meant. His daughter was making a deal with him. Qin Pei was in his hands. It was obvious that Liangqiu didn't want Anlin to know about his relationship with Qin Anlin's mother. In that case, someone had to take the blame for Hong Ku's death. His heart was filled with sorrow for Hong Ku's death, but at the same time, there was a wisp of excitement in his blood. Liangqiu was finally coming back. "I think we all know what kind of person you are." Yi Liangqiu looked at him. "My condition is to let Qin Pei go." This was the last wish of Anlin's mother. She wanted to fulfill her wish. However, Su Shiqing smiled coldly. "If I let him go, you'll probably immediately turn around and deal with me." His sadness only lasted for a moment. Yi Liangqiu had already seen through him. How could she not understand? She had lost this round of chess long ago. It wasn't just Anlin's mother and Qin Pei, but also the child in her stomach. "I will stay in the Su family as you wish." She compromised. "But you have to leave Qin Pei alive." One day, she would make Su Shiqing pay the price for everything he had done to her. Her mother, Anlin's mother, Su Qing, everyone. Chapter 1572. She would stay in the Su family and watch him die of old age. She wanted to end him with her own hands. Even if she lost everything, including Anlin. Even if she was rebellious, she still had to do it. She knelt down and used her sleeves to wipe away the blood on Lady Qin's face. Then she combed her hair neatly. She had always been a decent person. She had to leave with dignity. "Mom, I'm sorry." She had no other choice. When the fire rose to the sky, her fingers tightly clutched her stomach. where the child kept moving uneasily. Baby, this is Grandma. When you're born, you won't be able to see her. But Mom will always remember. Yi Liangqiu stood woodenly with her hands hanging by her sides. She was powerless. She couldn't save Lady Qin. She could only choose to let her leave with dignity. The sound of burning was like the sound of flowers quietly blooming in the dark night. Burning, blooming. It was Hong Ku, the last fireworks of her life. In that fire, outside in the wooden prison, Qin Pei's hand gripped the wooden bars tightly. His long nails dug into his flesh. Dark red blood flowed down his rough black skin. It was a shocking sight. His coarse and messy hair covered his face. His expression couldn't be seen. Only a pair of lifeless eyes could be seen looking upstairs. Hong Ku. Qin Pei murmured his wife's name. Only then did he vaguely remember that they were still husband and wife. Back then, they didn't divorce. He took his first love and ran away. Why were you so stupid? It's not worth it. I'm not worth it. There were 2 clear lines of tears on his face. However, these tears came too late. Was that fire Hong Ku? Hong Ku. He let out a mournful cry, but his body began to sink. He returned to that dark place. And after that, he returned to the world, but he could never see that face again. His last memory of her was those 2 lines of tears. She only cried for one person in her life. She shed all her tears for him, but in the end, she only received his repentance. Yi Liangqiu took Lady Qin's ashes and drove back to the place where Lady Qin lived. As soon as she returned, the thing she was holding in her hands gave Crispy Sleeve a fright. Liangqiu, you're pregnant. How can you hold such an inauspicious thing? It'll be terrible if old madam sees it. Yi Liangqiu's eyes were a little dull. Aunt Sue, Mom is here. Milky Sleeve looked left and right and patted Xiong's chest. This child is possessed. I don't know how Anlin took care of him. How could he touch such a thing? She reached out to take it away and throw it away, but her hand was scalded the moment she touched it. Why is it so hot? Yi Liangqiu hugged him tightly, her eyes staring straight at Qianqiu. Mom is inside. Crisp Sleeve was stunned. Then her facial muscles started to tremble, and she started to panic. Old madam, where's old madam? Old madam said she was taking a nap. Why wasn't she here for a few hours? She stared at the thing in Yi Liangqiu's hand. Then, she turned around and walked upstairs. She didn't believe it. She had to see old madam. Old madam must be sleeping soundly in the room. Liangqiu must have been possessed. It must be. The door opened suddenly, but Lady Qin wasn't in the bedroom. Chapter 1573. She stared blankly for a long time. Then, she heard a scream from the maid downstairs. She ran down and saw that Yi Liangqiu was slowly collapsing, but she was still hugging the box in her hands. She reached out to pull it open. Her hands had been scalded with 7 or 8 huge blisters. She was stunned and held the box for a long time. Old lady, is this you? Her hands were burning and her heart was trembling. After a long time, Su Xiu let out a sorrowful cry and then fainted. But the box was still in her hands. Similarly, Su Xiu's hands were scalded. The wound on their hands would never fade. When Yi Liangqiu woke up, she was on the bed in the bedroom upstairs. As soon as she woke up, she felt a burning pain in her hands. She raised her hands and glanced at them. Her hands were wrapped in strips of white cloth. They had already been bandaged. You're awake? She heard a familiar gentle voice. Yi Liangqiu sat up. To her surprise, it was Dr. Mei. Dr. Mei sat by the bed. Her voice was still gentle, but her expression was indescribably solemn. Anlin is dealing with his mother's funeral, so he asked me to take care of you. Yi Liangqiu heard the sound of chanting the Diamond Sutra coming from downstairs. One sound after another, it was like the door to that world. Liangqiu, Anlin is very sad. You have to understand. Dr. Mei was familiar with her and loved her as a junior. She knew Lady Qin even better. Although it was sudden, she felt that Liangqiu must have suffered a huge blow. This accident must have been a conspiracy. She hoped that she could convince Liang Qiu to tell the truth so that the murderer could be caught and Hong Ku's soul in heaven could be comforted. Speaking of this, Dr. May's eyes turned red. She was a doctor and should have seen through life and death. But Hong Ku had turned into a jar of ashes for no reason. Even she couldn't accept it, let alone Anlin. Hong Ku had worked hard to bring Anlin up. She had even handed over King Entertainment to Anlin. How could she accept this ending? Yi Liangqiu hugged her knees and buried her face. Her body trembled at the thought of Lady Qin leaving. She couldn't say it. She couldn't tell Anlin the truth. He wouldn't be able to take it. He would have to live in the shadow for the rest of his life. She did not speak. Dr. May sighed softly. It was not her place to meddle in this matter. As they were talking, the door opened, and a slender figure stood at the door. Dr. May looked at it for a while and patted Yi Liangqiu's shoulder. You guys talk. I'll go down and light some incense. She walked out. At the door, she said in a low voice, I remember she's pregnant. There was no expression on Qin Anlin's face. His usually handsome face was full of coldness. He clenched his fists and pursed his lips into a straight line. Auntie May, you can go down first? Dr. May sighed softly and went down first. But when she reached the middle of the stairs, the door upstairs was slammed shut. Her heart trembled. She wanted to go up but felt that it was inappropriate. In the end, she sighed again and went down. Downstairs, Soft Sleeve knelt in the morning hall. She was dressed in white and looked at Lady Qin's photo in a daze. What a pitiful person. Dr. May sighed softly. Soft Sleeve had grown up with Lady Qin and followed her to the Qin family. After Qin Pei left, it was Soft Sleeve who accompanied Hong Ku for the rest of her life. Chapter 1574. Dr. May slowly walked over and took the paper money from Su Xiu. As she burned it, she said in a low voice, When she was here, you treated her as your master and followed her for the rest of your life. Now that she's gone, you should take good care of yourself. Su Xiu, Hong Ku never treated you as a servant. She wanted the best for you. Su Xiu was still staring at the old lady's photo in a daze. Her tears never stopped. After a long time, she said softly, if she had passed away because of old age, I would have found a quiet place, bought a piece of land, and enjoyed a few years of happiness. But she passed away for no reason. It feels like a piece of my heart has been dug out. She turned her head and looked at Dr. May. There's hatred in my heart. I know it was done by that bastard, but I don't know why young madam didn't say anything. Only Yi Liangqiu knew the truth. But now that the old lady's body was gone, none of them knew what had happened, and no matter how much hatred Anlin had, he wouldn't be completely heartless to young madam. Dr. May lit a stick of incense and slowly bent down. After a while, she looked at the portrait of Lady Qin and said calmly but firmly, Su Xiu, do you believe that time will tell the truth? And she believed that Hong Ku wouldn't have doted on Liangqiu for nothing. That child had a forbearing attitude. She wasn't that kind of heartless person. Upstairs. Qin Anlin slammed the door. His face was gloomy, and a storm was brewing. He wasn't an idiot. She brought his mother back without saying a word. She was trying her best to cover up the truth, and it had something to do with Su Shurqing. Can you explain? He looked at her and slowly walked over. But he walked past her, walked to the window and looked out. His entire back was straight. He was enduring. He was afraid that he would lose control and hit her. She didn't speak. He took out a wrinkled pack of cigarettes from his pocket. There was only one cigarette in it. He took it out and put it on his lips, lighting it up and taking a long drag. He didn't turn around and waited for her to speak. After smoking half a cigarette, he finally turned around slowly, and his eyes fell on her face. Yi Liangqiu, is this your choice? She chose to tolerate such a despicable man and gloss over his mother's death? I didn't. She looked up at his face. In just a few hours, she had experienced life and death, while he had experienced death and betrayal. No? Then tell me, how did my mother die, and how did she turn into ashes? He closed his eyes and asked in a hoarse voice. Yi Liangqiu replied blankly, I was in a warehouse. I saw my mom being killed and then, she couldn't continue. She knew that lies were the easiest to be exposed. The more she said, the more flaws there would be. Qin Anlin turned around and walked towards her slowly. He held a cigarette in one hand and pinched her delicate chin with the other. He looked at her coldly. Then what? He's been burned to ashes, isn't he? Her eyelashes fluttered as she looked at him, and so did her lips. After a long time, she finally said, yes. He tightened his grip. Yi Liangqiu, do you think I'm a fool? His handsome face approached her. His eyes were filled with a storm. What are you trying to hide for? No matter what, he could indulge her. No matter what, she could have it. Even if she wanted king entertainment, he wouldn't blame her if she took it away. Chapter 1575. Their faces were very close to each other and their eyes were so close that they could almost see themselves in each other's eyes. No. She closed her eyes. When I got there, it was already like this. I saw Mom for the last time. Her body stiffened when she said that. Her jaw was almost crushed. Do you think I'll believe you? He looked at her in disappointment and his voice became colder. I'll ask you one last time, Yi Liangqiu, have you made your choice? She covered her face with her fingers. Anlin, I can't choose. Never. She looked up at him, tears trickling down from the corners of her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She smiled lightly. Will you hand me over to the police? He didn't hesitate. That one word also represented a break, represented his choice. Yi Liangqiu looked up. Then let me go. But before I go, let me burn some incense for Mom, she said in a low voice. After she said that, she received a hard slap on her face. Her face was tilted to one side. There was a handprint on her fair face and it was even swollen. She couldn't turn her face around for a long time. She touched her face with her bandaged hand and asked softly, You won't even give me this chance, right? You're not worthy. Qin Anlin spat out these words coldly. She was in pain, but he was in more pain than her. Within a day, he had lost two of the women he loved the most. Qin Anlin called the police and Yi Liangqiu was taken away and detained. She didn't defend herself and only said a few words at the police station. For those few days, the atmosphere in City B was heavy. On the day of Lady Qin's funeral, it was drizzling. Qin Anlin stood in front of her grave for the whole day. He was drenched by the rain and his face was wet. They had found Yi Liangqiu's phone records. Before the incident, it was Su Shicheng who called her. However, in the detention center, she didn't say a word. She didn't reveal a single word. Qin Anlin didn't look at her. He knew he was cruel, but he could only be cruel to her. He did not want to divorce her. There was no need. He was unwilling to let her go, and he was even more unwilling to let himself go. He wanted her to bear the name of Qin Anlin's wife for the rest of her life. The tombstone was soaked by the rain. He slowly squatted down. His tall body was dressed in black, which made him look even more solemn. She reached out and stroked Lady Qin's tombstone. Her voice was very low. Mom, I still can't stop loving her. I still can't be cruel to her. His head rested on the tombstone. On the tombstone, Hong Ku's youthful appearance was smiling, but it was soaked in water, as if she was weeping. The color of the sky gradually darkened. However, that smear of darkness did not leave for a long time. The sky was shrouded by dark clouds. The sky above B City was so dark that it was suffocating. The next day, Qin Anlin went to the detention center to see Yi Liangqiu. When she came out, she had lost a lot of weight. When she sat down, she looked up at him. He had lost weight, but his facial features and gaze looked sharper and colder. She had never seen Qin Anlin like this. She couldn't imagine what Anlin would do if he knew the truth and Qin Pei was killed. She couldn't imagine it. She would rather be the one who was hurt. Have you thought it through? His voice was hoarse and emotionless. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.